So to this evening's talk, I'm delighted to welcome Anne Hudson, who's going to talk about Samuel Crawley, the British Consul at Smyrna. Anne is a professional indexer of books and journals. She had a long life interest in history and archaeology and has published articles in various journals. She's been researching the life of Samuel Crawley, a direct ancestor, for many years, and wrote his biography for the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography. So welcome, Anne, over to you. And then after your talk, we'll have time for questions.
Thank you. Right, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to give this talk tonight. Can everyone hear me all right? Yes? My subject is the life and career of Samuel Crawley, British consul in Smyrna, now Izmir, from 1742 to 1762. And my plan is that by focusing on what a particular person, I'll be able to give you a bit of a snapshot of what life was like for the British in Smyrna during this 20-year period in the mid-18th century. I'm also going to explore the route he took to becoming the British consul and what happened to his family in Smyrna after he died. And I'm going to look at the part Samuel played in the early development of interest in classical antiquity. And that was what I focused on in the article I wrote for the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, this is the link to that, because that is what persuaded them that he was worthy of inclusion, because he was a bit of a pioneer in the study of classical antiquity. I must apologise, first of all, in the publicity for actually taking a year off his age. He was actually born in 1705, not 1706. So I apologise for that. I don't know how that happened. And he also happens to be my great-great-great-great-grandfather.
So let's just go back one slide.
Yes. Yes.
Biography page.
Yes, Oxford Dictionary of National Biography.
Okay, so he was married to Dashwood.
His mother was Dashwood.
Yeah.
Yes.
With great turkey munches.
Great.
Yes, turkey munches.
Absolutely.
Wickham.
I should be mentioning them in a minute.
Yes.
That comes soon. So the Crawleys were my grandmother's family. They were big landowners in Bedfordshire, and somebody actually wrote a family history of them, published in 1911, with family trees of all branches, and that's. And this is the family tree which has Samuel Crawley at the top. Oh, there's that on the screen. Good. My grandmother is Constance Harriet, who's in the bottom right-hand corner there. So we had this book when I was a child, and from childhood I've been fascinated by the description of my ancestor as consul at Smyrna. He stands out in his family tree, which mainly contains lawyers and clergymen and firmly based in England. I wondered, where was this place, Smyrna? And what was he doing there? What did a British consul do? And what was life like there? And how did his descendants end up back in England, where his son, grandson, and great-grandson were all country clergymen in England? And these questions remained mainly unanswered until my husband, after taking early retirement, had time to go to the National Archives and look at the Levant Company's records. And he found all sorts of references to Samuel Crawley. So that piqued my interest. And in about 20 years or so since then, I've been researching his life on and off in between work commitments. Samuel had many descendants, and several Crawley cousins have taken a great interest in my research and shared their knowledge and family archives with me, and some of them are here tonight, and some of them are on Zoom, which is lovely. One of them alerted me to the existence of a prayer book in Lambeth Palace Library. This is the title page. And it comes from the British consulate at Smyrna. How it got to Lambeth Palace Library, I have no idea.
I brought it.
You brought it? Oh. So, right, that's wonderful. Yes, thank you. Anyway, Samuel actually wrote in details of his marriage and children, so it's a really useful source. And this is the title page of that. And the link I was sent by my cousin took me to the Levantine Heritage Foundation, so that's how I discovered about you. I'll talk about the prayer book again later when I get to Samuel's family. So a little bit more about the sources. Of course, the Levant Company records and the National Archives are the basic source of information. But as some of you may know, there's not a great deal of other information about the British factory in Smyrna at this period. There's more known about earlier and later periods. So I've had to sort of dig around in all sorts of different sources, both printed and manuscript, and I'll be mentioning those as I go along. And of course, the internet has become increasingly useful since I started my research. Samuel Crawley is not that common a name, and occasionally Googling his name every few months tends to bring up sometimes new information which has gone online. And a lot of the travel books, the 18th century travel books, which I looked at in the British Library 10, 15 years ago, they're now all in facsimile online. So it makes everything much easier. And of course, the Levantine Heritage Foundation's website has wonderful resources, and I've looked at all sorts of the documents which are on the site, and also the links given in the newsletters to new research, which is very, very useful. One thing I haven't ever found is a likeness of Samuel Crawley. I have no idea what he looked like, which is very disappointing. I'd love to see a portrait, but I will show pictures of his wife and his son and other family members. So I'm going to start exploring Samuel's family background and his early life, and how and why his route to the Smyrna consulship was a bit unusual. So this is a family tree of Samuel's immediate family, which seems to it's moved around a bit, but never mind. So the Crawleys started as minor landowners owners in Bedfordshire, but like many families in the 16th and 17th centuries, they started to rise socially through getting involved in the legal profession, getting educated and becoming lawyers. And the family tree shows Samuel's immediate ancestors. First of all, his great-grandfather, Sir Francis Crawley, was a Justice of Common Pleas and was knighted by Charles I for supporting him in the ship money case. And he acquired a small castle in Bedfordshire through his marriage, Summery's Castle, which unfortunately is now right next to Luton Airport. But it seems to be his son's marriage which brought about the first family connections with the Levant. Because Francis Jr., his son, married Mary Clutterbuck. This has got a bit muddled up. Francis Crawley married Mary, daughter of Richard Clutterbuck. Of the Exchequer. Francis Crawley, curses a baron of the Exchequer, married Mary, daughter of Richard Clutterbuck, merchant in London. So it's scrambled itself somehow. I apologise. The Clutterbucks were originally Gloucestershire clothiers, but were now prominent in the Mercers' Company in the City of London. So it was a very useful marriage for both sides, I think. The Clutterbucks were rich, but they weren't really in the same social class as the Crawleys, who were sort of minor land gentry. But several Clutterbucks were merchants in Smyrna in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. And one of Francis and Mary's sons, Samuel's uncle, Francis Crawley, actually went to Aleppo, where he died young in 1680. So there's the Levant connection. Samuel's father, Richard Crawley, Register of Admiralty, another lawyer, he married into the Dashwood family. He married the daughter of Sir Samuel Dashwood, very eminent Lord Mayor of London. He was also MP for the city and master of the Vintners Company. They'd also come from the West Country. They were sheep farmers and wool merchants in Somerset, but were by now very prominent and rich London merchants. And this portrait in the Guildhall Library, the Guildhall Art Gallery, is supposed to show either Sir Samuel Dashwood or his brother Sir Francis. They're not quite sure which, but gives a good impression of what he might have looked like. Samuel was favoured by Queen Anne, who attended his mayoral feast in 1702, which was extremely lavish and cost the Vintners Company about £450. So much so, it's a lot of money in those days. So much so that when they had another Lord Mayor from the company 3 years later, they said, we won't have another pageant because it just costs too much. But Samuel Crawley was the second son of his father Richard, and he was born in the year of his grandfather's death, so I presume he was named after his grandfather. And it might have been Dashwood money, I guess it was Dashwood money through his marriage, which enabled his father Richard to buy a country estate in 1708 at Stockwood near Luton. Richard died in 1713. He was only in his 40s. Samuel was only 8 at this stage. And by his father's will, Samuel and his elder brother John were to be continued at school for some time and afterwards put forth and bred up in some profession, trade or other employment, such as my said wife shall think fit, and not to an idle life, which is a fairly typical sort of clause in wills of the London merchant class at the state. But Samuel's brother John didn't really happen to him like that, because he was actually bred up to be a country gentleman. He went to Eton, he went to Oxford, he went on the Grand Tour, which I'll mention later, and he built himself this country house on the new estate of Stockwood and went into Parliament. Unfortunately, when I went there with my parents in 1964. We were on our way somewhere. We thought we'd stop off and have a look at this house, and they just demolished it. So it was a sort of little hole in the ground, and that was it. Very disappointing. But it's now in a very rather grand large public park on the outskirts of Luton, Stockwood Park, and there's a small museum on the site which has material about the house. So, going back to Samuel, we don't know anything about Samuel's education. He didn't go to Eton, he didn't go to Oxford, but he was bred up for the merchant trade, and that's quite typical for a younger son of a city family. There's no evidence that he was formally apprenticed in the city or joined a livery company. I have searched quite hard and nothing has come up. But coming from quite a wealthy family, I think he was more likely to have been educated at home and perhaps attended one of the private academies offering commercial education, which was starting to appear in London at this date. And this slide shows an illustration from one of the many books published at this time giving commercial instruction. So merchants would have needed skills in mathematics, accounting, double entry bookkeeping, letter writing and foreign languages, a knowledge of customs duties, weights and measures, insurance and navigation. At some point we know that Samuel learned French because he wrote very well in French, and later when he was in Smyrna he was fluent in Italian, which of course was widely spoken in the Levant, and he also learned some ancient Greek. So what next? After this sort of education, the next stage would be for a young man to join a merchant house in London. And you can imagine Samuel's widowed mother, Sarah, approaching her Dashwood relations or Clutterbuck relations for help in finding an opening for young Samuel, perhaps as a junior partner in one of the city firms trading in the Levant. But that isn't actually what happened, because Samuel began his career not in the Levant, but in Italy. So you must now forgive me doing a brief excursion into Sicily. We will get to Smyrna in the end. So in May 1727, when he was nearly 22, Samuel was recorded in Messina in Sicily as a junior partner in the merchant firm of a certain William Allen. He'd inherited £4,000 at the age of 21, so I guess this might have been used to buy him a partnership into this firm. It was a good introduction to the overseas merchant trade, because the English nation, the group of English merchants in Messina, was quite small, but it was increasing at this date. And Messina was an important staging post for English ships en route to Venice and the Levant, and was also silk produced in Sicily itself, which was increasingly being exported to England. So this post for Samuel was a good introduction to the Levant trade and to the export market in silk. And when I was in the National Archives once, and I was searching through a couple of boxes of Chancery records, just on the off chance, because they were all bills and things for merchants in the Levant at this time and Sicily. And I found this document of 1734, which I don't really know how well you can see it, but it's actually a document signed by Allen and Crawley at the bottom, and it's about the exporting of orsoi, which is a high quality silk fabric from Messina. So that's another bit of information about his life in Messina. So what was Messina like in the early 18th century? This is a map that dates from 1676, so it's a little bit earlier, but I don't think things have changed greatly. Messina in the early 18th century was a very ramshackle place with dirty streets and dilapidated buildings, and there are unpleasant infestations of fleas, which were said to have a particular penchant for fair northern flesh. And outside the city, things are a little better. The countryside was infested by brigands, and no proper roads, any mule tracks. You can see on this map that there really aren't any roads. So the only way of travelling was by horseback, and this was pretty risky, really. There were landslides, floods, swollen rivers, lots of rain. So most people would have gone by sea when they wanted to get anywhere. Unfortunately, most of the important places were on or near the coast. However, for anyone interested in the ancient world, the Greek temples of Sicily were probably the best to be seen at this time without venturing into the Ottoman Empire itself. And many of the Greek sites, like Agrigento, Selinunte, and Syracuse, are on or within easy reach of the coast. And at this period, travellers were just beginning to discover Sicily. There weren't that many of them. They were just beginning to come at the beginning of the 18th century, and they had been coming by sea. And here's a view of the famous quarries of Syracuse, where the Athenian soldiers were imprisoned in the 5th century BC. And the illustration comes from John Breville's book, Remarks on Several Parts of Europe. And John Breville, interesting character, was among the first European travellers to appreciate Greek classical architecture as opposed to Roman. And it was him who escorted Samuel's brother John Crawley to Sicily as part of his grand tour in 1725. So I rather like to imagine that the two gentlemen in the picture are John Breville and John Crawley, but who knows. But we know Samuel was in Messina 2 years later. Maybe he was already there when his brother and John Breville visited, or maybe he possibly even travelled there with them. I don't know. But whether or not, we know that it was in Sicily that Samuel first became interested in Greek antiquities. So Greek coins from Sicily. Yeah, this is a picture of a Greek coin. And they're particularly special, the Greek coins from Sicily from the 6th to 2nd centuries BC, highly sought after by 18th century collectors, and they could be acquired very cheaply at the time. And while he was in Messina, Samuel encouraged the locals to bring him coins, and he amassed a large collection. He had more than 2,000 coins by 1732. He refers to them as medai or medals, and that, as was common at that time, but they are actually now known to have been used as coins. As well as collecting them for himself, he also acted as an agent for foreign collectors, sending consignments to London, where he had good contacts. And one of these was his mother's first cousin, Sir Francis Dashwood of West Wickham Park. And he's the famous Sir Francis Dashwood, who has quite a bad reputation as being a ne'er-do-well, convener of orgies, etc. But this seems to be unfair. I think he's been rehabilitated more recently. It seems to be a smear campaign. He was actually a very cultured man, and as a young man, he'd travelled widely in Italy and the Levant himself. And one of the founders of the Society of Dilettanti, who we'll hear about later on. Samuel enjoyed meeting English travellers coming to see the classical sites of Sicily, and probably also made a bit of money out of showing them around and selling them coins. And he was keen to encourage more people to come. And when they did, he made the most of them. In 1728, he managed to wangle himself onto a trip to Malta with a group of young English aristocrats who were visiting Messina. But one visitor became a lasting friend, a lifelong friend, and this was Jacques-Philippe d'Orville, who was a Dutch classical scholar based in Amsterdam. And he visited Sicily between May and July 1727, and he made an extensive tour of the island. He actually went by road, and braving the bad roads and the brigands, because he was very seasick, so he thought that was better than going round on the sea. And Samuel's letters to Orville are part of the Orville papers in the Bodleian Library in Oxford, and most of what I know about Samuel's time in Messina comes from them. They're written in simple French, and they give lots of information about Samuel's collecting activities and his life as a young man in a foreign city, socialising with the other English merchants, the soldiers of the garrison, and the nuns of the local convent. For example, soon after Orville left, Samuel told him that he'd been to visit La Belle dans le couvent de Saint-Grégoire, presumably one of the nuns. She'd asked for news of Orville and was put out to hear that he'd left without coming to say goodbye. Samuel wrote, "I offered her my undying sympathy. I flatter myself that I am in her good graces." Now a quick word about Naples. This is a view of Naples from the 18th century, and it's a city Samuel would have been very familiar with. Although they weren't formally merged until 1816, Naples and Sicily were ruled jointly at this period by the Austrians from 1720 and then the Spanish from 1734. And Naples was becoming a great centre for anyone interested in antique art. And Herculaneum was actually being excavated at this time. Sir Francis Dashwood visited those excavations in the late 1730s. Maybe he met Samuel then, I don't know. But Samuel got to know a rich Naples art collector, the Marchese Alessandro Rinuccini, a wealthy banker who had extensive collections of classical coins. And that was another friendship which was to endure for many years, as you'll hear later. Naples was also the obvious port of call for travellers coming to and from Messina, and Samuel himself stopped off in Naples on his way back to England for a visit in the 1730s. And now we get on to Smyrna. Samuel's life changed in 1742 when he was invited to take up the post of British Consul in Smyrna. His letter of appointment from the Levant Company reads, "It having been represented to us that you desired to enter into our service and would undertake to act as one of our consuls, upon the recommendation of your friends and assurances from them of your good character, we unanimously made choice of you to be our consul at Smyrna." He was 36 years old at this point. Presumably, as was often the case with the appointment of consuls, strings had been pulled by his family connections in the Levant Company, and perhaps Sir Francis Thatcher put in a word for them. But Messina and Smyrna had strong trading links anyway, and Samuel's experience of trade in Messina would have been very relevant for a role in Smyrna. And of course, a salaried post as consul brought great prestige and security. But for Samuel, the attraction of being in the Levant and Smyrna area with all the ancient sites must have been a great attraction too. But it took him more than a year to get there. And this is the timeline. He was appointed consul in March 1742. I found all these dates from the Levant Company papers in the National Archives. His letter of appointment is dated in March. It would have taken a couple of months to get to Messina, probably. But he said he was planning to leave in October 1742, but he was still there in December. And then he told the Levant Company that he'd sent off to Livorno to get a ship to call at Messina and take him to Smyrna. But the next thing that happened was the merchants in Smyrna in February 1743 heard that he'd in fact found that there was a ship going to Marseille and he'd gone back to England to sort out his affairs. He's a bit cheeky, I think. And he finally arrived in Smyrna in September 1743. Meanwhile, the members of the merchant community had sort of stood in for him and taken over the consul's various duties. I guess this was probably fairly normal when a new consul was appointed because, communications were slow and often they came from somewhere else. So there must often have been these little gaps between one consul and the next. So Samuel was to spend the rest of his life in Smyrna, 20 years. Oops, that's it. Here's a view of Smyrna. Oh. That's it. Sorry. Slides are running away with me. There's no evidence that he ever returned to England, and I think I would have known because whenever a consul went home, there were lots of stuff in the Levant Company archives. So I think he spent the rest of his life there. His long residence in Smyrna would have brought him intimate knowledge of the local situation and given valuable continuity to the English factory, where merchants tended to come and go. A young man would go out to Smyrna as a junior partner in a firm, and then after a few years, he'd hope to become a senior partner, and then he'd go home. But the consul was more of a fixture. And although the consuls were paid by the Levant Company and not the British government, they were expected to keep an eye on the political situation down there and liaise with the British Navy. Ships were deployed in the Mediterranean to protect the Levant Company's vessels in time of war. And I found some letters in the East Riding of Yorkshire Record Office from Samuel to various admirals commanding the Mediterranean fleet during the War of the Austrian Succession in the 1740s. For example, he gave some advice in 1745 to the admiral. 2 naval ships had put into harbour at the island of Milos, north of Crete, and were stuck there because of northerly winds. Samuel wrote, "I beg leave to hint that Milo is the most improper place His Majesty's ships can go to, unless in case of extreme necessity," and went on to list the reasons: the northerly winds, the French consul there with great power and interest, bad air in summer, and a water shortage. He suggested other more suitable ports. The French had eyes and ears everywhere. Priests and friars on the islands gave them typhus, and the French consul in Smyrna passed on news of British movements. But of course, Samuel's main duties as consul were looking after the English factory, making sure the dues on merchant shipping were collected, and keeping up good relations with the local Ottoman officials. The Levant Company papers don't show any evidence that he didn't do a good job. but there were frequent wrangles with the company about expenses. Funding for extras had to be applied for. For instance, on one occasion, Samuel asked the company for a replacement fire engine and fire buckets. Fire was a real danger because so many buildings were at least partly built of wood, so there were many fires. And another major expense was hospitality. Consuls were expected to offer hospitality to British travellers, including all the young aristocrats who were passing through Smyrna while on their grand tour. They expected to be put up in the consulate and lavishly entertained, and this cost money. So in 1751, Samuel asked for a raise in his salary because of all the entertaining he had to do. The company refused, but agreed to pay any necessary expenses for entertaining noblemen or gentlemen travellers for the honour of the nation. But Samuel would have really enjoyed the visits of serious antiquarian travellers who were coming in increasing numbers now to study the ancient remains. This slide shows the Roman aqueduct in Smyrna at the bottom right, and then an old print at Ephesus, which of course had been visited by foreign travellers for many years since the early 17th century. And in Smyrna, which was an important Greek city as well, of course, bits and pieces of classical sculpture were turning up all the time. So it was a place that people like to visit. And Smyrna and Ephesus were among the 7 churches of Asia mentioned in the book of Revelation. And it was quite popular to go on a tour of the 7 churches of Asia, and they were all fairly near Smyrna and Ephesus. Samuel was still collecting coins, and other English merchants in Smyrna also collected antiquities. And the chaplains and the Levant factories, each consulate had a paid resident chaplain. And the chaplains often applied for the job because they liked the idea of studying the ancient remains or studying church history or Oriental languages. For instance, the Reverend Charles Burdett, chaplain at Smyrna during part of Samuel's time, used to like guiding the antiquarian visitors around the ruins of ancient Smyrna. So I'm going to say a bit more now about the various antiquarian travellers who visited Smyrna. This is Alexander Drummond. He's the first one, interesting character. He went to Smyrna in 1744 and got to know Samuel and other members of the English community. He studied the local antiquities. The slideshow, this slide shows illustrations of Smyrna from his later book, but he also enjoyed the social life that the small English community could offer. For instance, he took part in an assembly to which Mr. Consul Crawley did me the honour to introduce me on the first night. Samuel and Drummond formed a lasting friendship, and in the British Library there are Drummond's letter books, copies of all the letters he wrote, and that includes several letters to Samuel, full of happy reminiscences of his time in Smyrna, which he saw as paradise compared to the hell of Alexandretta, Scanderoon, the port of Aleppo, where he was vice consul at the time, which apparently was a pretty awful place to be. And other travellers came. This is a list of very antiquarian travellers to Smyrna. Sorry, some of this printing is slipped slightly, but I think you can read it. Dr. Anthony Askew came in 1747, touring ancient sites, collecting Greek manuscripts, and he left a collection of Greek and Latin inscriptions in Samuel's care at Smyrna. It seems that at this period, foreigners could collect and export antiquities without any restrictions, unlike in the 19th century when the Ottoman authorities started to clamp down on exports. Robert Wood came, the antiquarian Homeric scholar. He spent a week in Smyrna with 2 companions in 1750, enjoying Samuel's hospitality, staying in the consular house, exploring the antiquities, and enjoying the company of the English factory, who form a small but very agreeable community. And Wood published his famous book, The Ruins of Palmyra, an important influence on English neoclassicism in 1753. All these antiquarian travellers seem to have known each other. It's quite a small world. And Wood and Drummond knew each other, and Wood also met James Athenian Stewart and Nicholas Rivette in Rome. And there were letters between them which mentioned Samuel's name. Stewart and Rivette came in the 1750s and were entertained by Samuel, and he subscribed the first volume of their famous Antiquities of Athens, which was a great influence on English architecture, published in 1762. And Rivette was later to design garden buildings for Samuel's cousin Sir Francis Dashwood at West Wickham Park, so another connection there. Samuel just missed the visit of the much younger Richard Chandler, who was sponsored by the Society of Dilettanti to visit in 1764. At this point, the Hochepied family, who figures strongly in the later part of this talk, come on the scene. Their good friend of Samuel and a fellow enthusiast for antiquities was the Dutch consul, Daniel Alexander de Hochepied, Comte de Hochepied. They were originally Amsterdam merchants and were reputed to be of French and I presume Huguenot origin. The British and the Dutch were really quite close to each other at this period, since the Glorious Revolution in 1688, with William and Mary on the throne. Cultural and political links had been strengthening, and they were also united as being Protestants. So it was natural that the British and the Dutch merchants in the Levant would get on well together, although they were also trading rivals. And Samuel Crawley and the Comte de Hochepied would have a lot in common. A successive Hochepieds held the post of Dutch consul in Smyrna from 1688 onwards. And this picture, this very well-known picture in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, is a view of Smyrna showing a reception given to the Hochepied Dutch consul. People don't seem to agree about the date of this, but to me, the dress, the clothes, at least the Western ones, look a bit later than the 1720s. So I guess it may show Samuel's friend, the Comte de Hochepied, who succeeded as consul in 1723. I want to say something now about what life was like for the Franks or the Europeans in Smyrna. There are lots of contemporary reports about their enjoyable social life. Richard Pocock, later an Irish bishop, who visited just before Samuel came, wrote, "The great number of Franks who are settled here makes Smyrna a very agreeable place, and there is no want of good company. They live in a very sociable manner and are particularly civil to strangers." Charles Thompson, who visited just before that, described the English factory as perhaps the noblest in the world, consisting generally of 80 or 100 persons, most of them young gentlemen of the best families, and frequently younger sons of peers. And he was there for Christmas, and he described the Christmas celebrations, which clearly felt like home from home. What made this gloomy season pass away the more agreeably was the good company of our countrymen and other European merchants, who maintain a cheerful correspondence one with another. And in particular, we spent our Christmas, the usual time of feasting and rejoicing among Christians, with the greatest pleasure and satisfaction, paying and receiving mutual visits and compliments, and indulging ourselves in innocent mirth with the same freedom as if we had been in our native country or any other part of Europe. So the social life of the Franks in Smyrna was based on Frank Street, which was said to be the handsomest street in Smyrna. This picture is from the Musée de la Marine in Paris and shows the procession of a French admiral in 1766, but it shows the facades of the grand houses in Frank Street, which would have been the consulates of the various nationalities and houses of other rich merchants. They're on the north side of the street, on the side next to the sea, with warehouses and landing stages behind. You can actually see the sea in the background to this picture. I think it's the sea, actually. It seems to have clouds in it, so maybe it's the sky. But anyway, the sea is behind. We don't know where the British consulate was, unfortunately, but I'm sure it would have looked like one of these houses.
If you would go one slide back,
Yes,
I can pinpoint British consulate as it was. It was right here.
I think that may have been a bit later on. Oh yes, there's a flag, isn't there?
Yes, this is a,
Oh, that's true. Yes.
a British merchant navy flag, unless it's a Genoese one,
There's
because
actually
it shared its
green
flags.
flag there. Yeah.
And this is the French consulate
Right. Okay.
with the fleur de lis.
Oh yes. And the Dutch.
And that's
Yes.
Dutch.
Right. I hadn't noticed that. Thank you. Right. Look into that. Okay. Yes, sorry. So Frank Street was a refuge from the bustle of the great international trading city of Smyrna with its cosmopolitan population. Somebody at the turn of the century wrote, "When we are in the street, we seem to be in Christendom. They speak nothing but Italian, French, English, or Dutch there." And other sources describe it as a private enclave, which was actually locked up at night for security. But more recent research seems to give a slightly different view. There's a very recent thesis by a Turkish scholar, which talks about Frank Street as having both local and foreign components. a hybrid environment rather than a European-dominated urban space, as was assumed in general. So I think there's a bit of controversy about what Frank Street was actually like. Some of the 18th century travel books were published long after the people actually visited, and some of them were sort of rather garbled when they were put together by somebody else for publication. So I don't think you can believe everything that was said there. This is I'm sorry, it's a photocopy of a photocopy from an old Murray's guide, but it shows the original line of Frank Street. If you look at the coast, and then the first street in is Frank Street, and you can see it's quite sort of windy, lots of twists and turns, because it followed the original line of the coast. Over the years, the shoreline had changed because buildings were extended by building new wooden piers and other structures. It's very different now.
Also, an English church or Protestant church.
The chapel in the consulate.
In the Consul.
Yes, that's where they went. So now there's this wide promenade and a line of mostly 6-story buildings. This is actually a view from a hotel when my husband and I stayed in Smyrna once, and it does show the lovely mountainous setting of Smyrna very clearly. But this picture shows what the shoreline looked like in 1779. That's a detail from the painting I showed earlier. And you can see all the little buildings on stilts pushed out into the sea. The living quarters in the houses like the British Consulate were upstairs, and they were very spacious and handsome. Above the warehouses stretching to the shore, there were long covered galleries leading to terraces open to the sea and cooled by refreshing breezes, very welcome in the hot climate of Smyrna. And there were also delightful gardens with groves of orange and lemon trees, so it is said. Another view of Smyrna, I think 18th century. Yes, lots of ships. As well as living accommodation for the consul and his family, as I've said, they had to have lots of rooms to put up guests, and also the offices, the consular offices and the chapel where the English community worshipped. The consul had to provide board and lodging for the chaplain. When a new chaplain came in 1752, the company wrote to Samuel, hoping that he may have the same rooms in your house in town and country and partake of your plentiful table at noon and at night, as has been practiced towards his predecessors. And there was a library at the consulate for the use of the English community. Batches of books were regularly sent out by the company in London. Sometimes the chaplain would send a list of requests, but the lists of books show that they were all very serious, improving works, all non-fiction, and one does wonder how popular these were among the young men of the factory. So although the Europeans did their best to make life in Smyrna as home-like as possible, there were drawbacks. It is very hot in summer, and in the 18th century there were frequent outbreaks of plague, very serious. So people tended to escape to the countryside when they could. The countryside around Smyrna was lovely. Olives, vines, figs, almonds and melons grew in profusion, and there were large flocks of sheep, goats and cattle. And broad river valleys between the mountain ranges were ideal for English country sports. On Saturdays, it was said that the English merchants all took the day off and would go hunting, hawking, shooting and fishing. And some of them actually kept packs of greyhounds and beagles for hunting, which the natives found very strange. The nature of the Levant trade, of course, was that it was very seasonal. There were certain very busy times of year when they were collecting all the merchandise and getting it on the ships. And then other periods of the year when there was nothing much to do. So you can imagine that they would amuse themselves in this way. But the consuls and the richer merchants actually had country houses in the nearby villages where they could retreat during the hot summer months and escape from outbreaks of plague. And one of these was Sedico, which is now Gazimir, and where Samuel bought a house in the 1740s. I don't know where Samuel's house was, unfortunately. I don't know that anything survives, but these photographs of the house of the de Hochepied family, probably built in the mid-18th century and still in existence in 1978. These pictures come from various sources. I'm not actually convinced they're actually the same house. So if anyone has any information, I'd be interested to hear. But they do give an idea of what a country house of a rich Westerner in the 18th century might have looked like. So any information about that would be much welcomed. And now moving on to Samuel's marriage and his family. Samuel Crawley was a bachelor when he first came to Smyrna, but in the spring of 1749, he took a trip to Constantinople at the invitation of his friend, the British ambassador James Porter. And there he met an attractive young lady, Marie Dunant, and wrote to the Levant Company in London asking for permission to marry her. The company wrote back, thanking him for informing them that you have a mind to change your condition, having found at Constantinople a Protestant of French extraction, who you say is a woman of good character and merit. We shall not oppose you in what you think necessary and convenient for you. And the experience we have had of your prudence and good temper makes us hope that this change of life will cause no alteration in that agreement you have kept up with the factory hitherto. So, wishing you all imaginable happiness and satisfaction when we remain, etc. Clearly, it was vital that Samuel's bride should be a Protestant. He couldn't possibly have married a Catholic at this period. And the Dunants were Protestants originating from Geneva. In Constantinople, they were watchmakers or they were merchants in watches and very fine, expensive jewellery. Alexander Drummond wrote to one of his merchant friends in Smyrna, I find Mr. Consul Crawley had obtained the company's consent for marrying, and as I hear a mighty good character of a young lady, I hope all of you will be happy, he in her thousands of charms and you in her conversation. Well, she was a striking young lady, as is shown in her pastel portrait done in Constantinople by Leotard, which is still owned by members of the Crawley family. She's wearing Turkish costume, following the fashion set by Lady Wortley Montagu earlier in the century. So Marie travelled from Constantinople to Smyrna with her mother and one of her brothers a few days before the wedding in the consular chapel in Smyrna on the 9th of December 1749. She was at least 20 years younger than Samuel, who was now 44. And here we get back to the Book of Common Prayer from the Smyrna Anglican chaplaincy, which I mentioned earlier. And I'm very grateful to my friend over there who actually brought it to England because it's extremely valuable. You can see on the right some of the entries which Samuel has actually written himself about his family. The first child, a boy, was born in 1750. Alexander Drummond wrote to congratulate Samuel on what he heard was a most glorious boy. But don't, my dear sir, stop, go on and prosper, for one ought never to be aweary of well-doing. And this was actually good advice, because very sadly, this first child died of smallpox less than 2 years later. But they did have 6 more children between 1751 and 1759, and 5 of them survived in infancy, which isn't bad, really, considering what a place where they live with all sorts of dangers possible. Samuel recorded the dates of birth and baptism and of childhood illnesses in the book. For instance, they all had smallpox in 1757, but the rest of them all survived it. And the godparents are also listed, and that gives interesting insights into Samuel's family relationships and friends. Although he doesn't seem he'd been back to England since 1743, he clearly kept up with his family back home. His mother, his brother John, and various other relations were all godparents, of course represented by proxies. But other godparents came from outside the family, and here's a little list of them. 2 of them were acquaintances, which must have dated back to the Messina days, the Marchese Alessandro Rinuccini of Naples, who I mentioned before, although he was presumably a Roman Catholic, so I'm not quite sure how they got around that. And also the famous diplomat Sustania Porton, who was related to Samuel's Messina business partner, William Allen, and he'd been in Messina as a young man, so presumably he and Samuel must have met at that stage. And the close relationships between the Levant Company officials at the various factories are demonstrated by the inclusion as godparents of Arthur Pollard, a former British consul at Aleppo, and the Reverend Thomas Paine, a former chaplain at the British Embassy at Constantinople. Jacques-Philippe d'Orville would doubtless have been asked as well, but unfortunately he died in September 1751. Didn't live quite long enough. Well, Samuel Crawley's 20 years as British consul was a longer term than any of his 18th century predecessors, and he was still in post when he died in Smyrna on the night of the 11th of January 1762. He died after a long illness from hypoxia, low levels of oxygen in the blood, which was described in the Levant Company archives as a stagnation of blood in the lungs, which sounds pretty horrible. The Smyrna merchants wrote to the ambassador, James Porter, to tell him the news, saying, the perfect knowledge which your excellency had of his integrity and other valuable qualities cannot but make you sensible how much we are affected with the loss. And I put the ambassador's response on the slide, very swift and heartfelt, about the sensible and affecting news of the death of that very worthy, that very honest and deserving man, Mr. Crawley, one of the best men I have known, and are more to be regretted both in private and public life in this degenerate age. Well, I know that in the 18th century they used to go into this sort of hyperbole, but it does suggest he was a bit exceptional, I think. He was buried on the 12th of January, being taken to his burial place by ship. The English and Dutch cemeteries at this time were to the south of the centre near the sea and were said to contain impressive sculptured marble tombs. And presumably he would have had a very grand tomb, but that burial ground was superseded quite soon, and no trace survives of his grave. This is the beginning of his will. Years of residence in the Levant were recorded with luck by the acquisition of a modest fortune, but he doesn't seem to have been that wealthy, but he doesn't seem to have done too badly. Marie was left a substantial sum of money, plus the furniture from her bedchamber and dressing room at Smyrna, and all the contents of the house at Sedke. Other bequests included several works of art, including a battle piece of Constantine upon marble, which sounds like antique sculpture. But sadly, no trace of any of his possessions survives, apart, of course, from his wife's portrait. The terms of the will suggest that Samuel envisaged the family being split up, and that's what happened. Marie was left money for the maintenance and education of those who remain with her, and that is Samuel's 3 daughters. But his 2 young sons, Ambrose and Richard, Ambrose was 7 when his father died, and Richard was 5, were sent to England, and there was money put aside to be used by the executors to settle them early and advantageously in the world. I don't know exactly when they came to England, but I think it was pretty soon after Samuel died, so they were very young. And they were placed in the guardianship of a first cousin of Samuel, George Medley, of Buxted Park in East Sussex. The Medleys were another family involved in the Levant trade, and George Medley was very rich. He was the youngest of 4 brothers, but the other 3 had conveniently died young, so he got all the money and huge estates in Sussex. The elder brother Ambrose became a London merchant. He had just 1 son who died young and unmarried, so has no descendants. But Richard, my great-great-great-grandfather, became the rector of Rotherfield in East Sussex and died in 1836, leaving a large family. Again, I'm afraid the typing's got a bit scrambled there. Reverend Richard Crawley, 1756 to 1836. So he's the ancestor of all of us Crawley people who are here tonight. Now, the portrait of Marie Dunant, which you've seen before, was actually in Richard's family by at least the mid-19th century. And if you look on the right-hand side of this photograph, you can see it hanging on the wall of his son's Monmouthshire rectory in around the 1860s. Of course, I don't know when it came to England. We don't know anything about it until it turned up in this photograph. But I like to think that they sent the picture with the 2 young boys to England to be a remembrance of their mother, but we have no way of knowing. So Marie was at least 20 years younger than Samuel and only in her mid-30s when he died. And to be a young widow with 3 daughters in a British outpost in an alien land can't have been a very comfortable situation to be in. But as we've seen, Samuel had been a great friend of the Dutch consul, the Comte de Hochpied. So Marie must already have known his son, Daniel Jean Comte de Hochpied, who was very close to her in age, and he'd succeeded his father in 1759. And in 1763, the year after Samuel's death, they married. Marie was to have 5 more children, making a total of 10 surviving children from her 2 marriages. It seems that Samuel's daughters and the new young family lived happily together. The Comte de Hochpied seems to have been a good stepfather, keeping up with his stepsons in England and complaining in 1777 that they didn't write to him often enough. We don't know if the 2 boys ever again saw their mother and sisters in Smyrna, but the families did remain close, because if you look at their various wills, they're sort of bequeathing things to each other, and obviously kept up. So what happened to Samuel's daughters? Here's a list of Samuel and Marie's children. The youngest girl, Sarah, married the Chancellor of the Dutch Consulate, Conrad Godard Nicholas Schutz, who's an interesting character. He travelled overland from the Netherlands to Constantinople in 1756, and wrote a fascinating account of his journey. And that is actually on the Levantine Heritage Foundation website, edited by Chantal Petrucci. He was actually 30 years older than Sarah, and he died in 1802. But she lived until 1821, and there were four surviving children. One son became Dutch consul in Alexandria, and one daughter married Peter van Lennep, member of another very prominent Smyrna family, Dutch Smyrna family. And this very well-known painting shows a different branch of the van Lennep family of Smyrna, but it does give a good impression of a well-to-do Smyrna merchant family in 1770. About 1770, it's in the Rijksmuseum. Interesting, some of them are in Turkish dress, and some of them are in Western dress. So I don't know what means that.
So smart.
Sorry, very smart. Yes.
So smart.
So Samuel's middle daughter Harriet also found her husband in Smyrna, but he was English. In 1770, a British fleet was sent to Smyrna to protect British trading interests, because there was a violent uprising in the city and they were worried that the British would be attacked. And one of the naval captains, William Affleck, he was the commander of one of the ships. And I'm sure that the people in Smyrna would have been very glad to have some British naval officers to sort of mix in society. And the result was that William and Harriet were married in 1773. Just back to the list. The first daughter, Susanna, married somebody who's supposed to have been called Chateauneuf, and I don't know anything about him. The name appeared in a 19th century genealogy, which isn't awfully reliable, so I don't know anymore. But if anyone can throw any light on that, I'd be very grateful. I won't go here into the marriages and families of Marie's second family because time is running out, and there's plenty of useful genealogical material on the Levantine Heritage Foundation website, the Hochepiers, Van Lenneps, and so on. With a limited pool of suitable marriage partners, there was much intermarrying between the cousins, and it all gets very complicated. But a lot of their gravestones still survive in the garden of the old Dutch chapel in Izmir. And my husband and I went there in 2007, and we were shown around by the then Dutch consul, the late Mr. Karel de Kiel. And we photographed and transcribed many family inscriptions. There's now also a photographic record on the Levantine Heritage website. The grandson of Sam and Marie's daughter, Sarah Schutz, is there, and also the gravestone of Marie's second husband, the Comte de Hochepier, which is there. So he died in 1796. Marie survived him by 5 years and was described in later life as a very charming and intelligent woman. One of her sons-in-law called her "my charming, adorable, and lovable mother-in-law." According to some reports, Marie became something of a local celebrity as the Madama of Smyrna or the Madama of Sedico. This Madama was said to be a beautiful woman with a strong personality and an excellent mind, who spoke 8 different languages and could converse knowledgeably about politics and commerce. However, there's a bit of confusion here, and it seems more likely that an earlier Comtesse de Hochepier was in fact the famous Madama. But whether or not, Marie was clearly a strong character. In 1797, the Franciscan mission in Smyrna burned down, and the friars sold part of the site to raise money for rebuilding. But this was challenged by the Countess Maria de Hochepier-Dunon, widow of the late Dutch consul, who claimed that the Hochepier family owned the site. And there was a lawsuit. Marie lost, resulting in a threat of an international incident when the old lady refused to accept the verdict. So she was obviously a bit of a toughie in old age. She died in 1801, aged about 74, and was buried in Smyrna, but again, her gravestone doesn't survive. So, this is another picture of the interior of the Hochepier house in Sedico, and there were still Hochepiers in Smyrna and Sedico until the great catastrophe of 1922, when the last of them buried some family portraits and valuables for safekeeping in the garden at Sedico. But when he returned later in the year, there was nothing left. The house was occupied by refugees and everything was lost. The thought that there might have been a portrait of Samuel Crawley in this house up till 1922 is very tantalising, as I would love to know what he looked like. But apparently there was a tapestry with the arms of the Hochepier family, which was actually made by Marie, which survived in 1924. I wonder if that still exists, and if so, where is it now? So, thank you for listening. I'm working on a longer version of this talk, which Levantine Heritage Foundation have kindly agreed I can put as a PDF on their website. That'll include a lot more detail and full references, and I'm hoping to complete this in the next 2 months. So if anyone has any information about anything I've said tonight, please get in touch. My email address is there, annhudson84@gmail.com. So thank you for listening.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Anne. Excellent talk. Fascinating record, and also wonderful pictures and a couple of paintings I've not seen before.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
very good. So does anyone have a question or comment they'd like to ask? Yes.
Yes, fascinating talk, thank you so much. Two questions I'd like to ask. You can hardly do research into any 18th century family these days in Asia or the Mediterranean. It doesn't bring up some horror story about abuse or slavery. I don't know how much the Levant companies were involved with slavery, Arab slavery or that. I mean, they obviously wouldn't talk about it, or perhaps they wouldn't talk about it, but anything hidden there that one should be looking for.
Well, Sir Samuel Dashwood was heavily involved in the Royal Africa Company. So he's on there's a website, isn't there, about slavery and people involved in slavery, and he is on that. So we do have, I'm afraid, some family involvement, but I haven't come across anything else.
My other question, if I may.
Yes.
1922 was obviously a horrific year in Smyrna, appalling year of slaughter. Was the Hushbay house vandalised then? I didn't catch quite.
Well, this comes from Philip Mansell's book, and he says that the Hoshplay family member went back and found it was occupied by refugees, and what he buried in the garden had disappeared. So I don't know. I assume so, but I believe that the house does still survive in some form, although I haven't been there to see. Unfortunately, when my husband and I were in Smyrna some years ago, we were very keen to find out where Sediko was, and we didn't know. And we saw a bus which did Zetinköy on the front, and we thought, oh, that must be it. So we got on the bus and went off to Zetinköy and talked to the locals and said, I think my great-great-grandfather lived here. And they got terribly excited, just cups of tea and things, and didn't find anything. And then in the end, we found it wasn't the right place at all. It was actually what's now Gazimir, and we haven't been back to Smyrna since, so haven't been able to go and explore.
Who would the refugees be who were in the country?
Well, presumably they were
Well, if Sedikoy was outside the destroyed part of the city, there would be the refugees from the city.
Smyrna, yes.
Smyrna.
Yes, that would be it. Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne. Was there enough? Thank you. I learned so much. It was very fascinating. I know it's only tangential to what you're looking at, but you mentioned the library, the consulate in Smyrna, and the books.
Yes.
Books.
Yes.
And I wondered where that information comes from. Do you have a library?
It's in the Levant Company record somewhere. I can't remember exactly where, but I think there were actually lists of books that the company sent out. So in the National Archives, there were lots of series.
So that would be in the Kew Gardens.
Yes. So,
interesting. I asked because I'm interested in library history, but also 17th century Orientalism. And there was a chaplain at the Smyrna Consul called Edward Stringer, and apparently he wrote a Turkish dictionary, which was very good.
Okay.
What's his name?
Edward Stringer or Springer.
What date was that?
There are references. It's 17th century, and there are references to this dictionary, but never came up anywhere. And I wondered if there was a copy.
No, I've never come across that.
Which year was that?
In the 17th century, 1816,
Quite early.
20,
It's quite early.
40s,
Yes.
1640s.
Right. Yes.
Yeah, there are references in Edward Pocock's work and John Greaves to this particular Turkish Latin dictionary, but then the dictionary is nowhere to be found.
Um,
It was probably in manuscript and several copies that
mm,
was circulating among the early modern Orientalists who were
interesting.
connected to the Constantinople and Aleppo and
They weren't the first dictionaries.
yeah,
So,
earlier.
yeah.
Does anybody know how the portrait of their wife, got into the rectory at Bromley?
No, we don't. I
Where
wish,
is it now?
I wish we did. It's
It would be
in,
useful, wouldn't it?
I think it's in your house, isn't it? The portrait,
It would be, yes, it's in my house.
yes.
Well, why did it get into the rectory at Broadway?
Well, it's
Hmm.
obviously,
We think it must have been sent, as Anne said, we think it must have been sent back.
the rector was his grandson.
Mm,
The rector whose rector it was
Yeah.
Samuel's grandson.
yes.
So at some point, yes, it came down through the family, but we don't
Must have
know.
been folded up, it's the frame, it's an English frame.
Yes, yes. And it's a
Hmm.
pass, it's
Yeah.
quite a vulnerable sort of picture, isn't it? It's been a bit damaged over the years.
One of the main things that comes out of all this is how important it is to record.
Yes,
To record pictures, record speeches, record letters, record connections. It's really right and worth a whole lot of other stories
yes,
were learned from this.
yes. If only they recorded a bit more.
Yes, but you should all go home and dig
I
out
write down exactly what.
your memoirs.
Yes.
I take a photograph of this
Yes, please.
august gathering.
Yep. So I just want to check, any questions or comments online? Um,
I wonder, Chairman, if I may, please.
Yes, Jonathan, yeah.
Yeah, Jonathan Beard. The absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much indeed. And it's absolutely such an important part of the LHF to bring all these wonderful stories and anecdotes together. I'm asking about the Whitall and the Giraud family. The Whittalls, as I understand, if I'm not mistaken, arrived in Smyrna in 1792 and became consuls and commerce and businessmen, and the Girauds as well. And in fact, Brian Giraud is a very good friend of mine.
Yes.
And I wonder if you've got something to mention about these two families.
No, I'm afraid it's sort of after my period, really. I very much focused on them on the 18th century. I've heard of them, certainly, but no special knowledge, I'm afraid.
Just on the Crawley, given so many Crawleys connections here, the famous broadcaster cricketing Aidan Crawley
Right.
is a connection of yours via Gloucestershire and then back to the
I don't know.
Bedfordshire. I do. I can show you how.
Oh.
Through moving.
Okay.
It's very distinguished for a cricketing lot.
Right.
It was very interesting. And in Google, he was also bizarrely, he was assistant air attaché at ostensibly in Ankara in 1943.
Interesting.
There you are. But he is a
Well, we obviously wondered when he was famous whether we were related to him.
You are.
And
And if you want chapter and verse, I'll give it to you.
Yes.
With an awful lot of boys, and Samuel did have a great many distinct
Well, I
endings.
can take you all the way back.
Or even what's that question?
Yeah.
George Baden Crawley was the railway contractor who was this great guy.
So, Ariba, you've got a question.
I really enjoyed your talk, and I also work on the 18th century and published a book on the French community in Galata. So a lot of, kind of sounds familiar to me, looking at the French in depth in Galata, Constantinople. And when I was working on that topic, actually in the Ottoman archives, they have, really rich stuff. It's called the Ecnebi Defterleri, the registers of foreign nations. And you get a lot of correspondence from the consuls, from the ambassadors, in Istanbul and consuls all over with the Imperial Council in Istanbul. So these are legal issues, extortions, taxes, what's going on locally. And then if the local judge cannot resolve the issues, then they would write to Istanbul. So that's like, where, of course, those of us who know Ottoman, and I'm planning to work actually on the British archives because I'm doing now trade with Iran, silk. And Izmir was a big hub for Iranian silk,
Yes.
right? And London becomes a very big center of silk production. So they need raw silk, from all over the place, not just Italy or Spain, also from Iran.
Yes.
So they're very, active and involved. It's not just the French, the English also are importing a huge amount of raw silk, Iranian raw silk in the 18th century. So anyway, so I'm planning to look at the British records there. And if I come up with anything on Samuel Crawley, I will let you know through
That'd be
Craig.
absolutely wonderful, because I have no Turkish, so I have no access to those at all. So yes, anything you find, I'd be very grateful to hear. Thank you.
Speaker mentioned the indigenous visitors and so on is all the antiquities around Smyrna. In the instructions to Samuel Crawley, were there any instructions about seeking to acquire antiquities for this country, to come back to this country, because subsequent consuls,
Yes.
of course, did receive that sort of instruction?
I don't think so, no. I think at that date, no, because none of the national museums had been founded at that date.
Precisely.
So no, it would have been just individuals who were collecting. I think they probably acted as sort of agents to, send things back to wealthy aristocrats, but not for the country. No. A bit contrast of what happened in the 19th century.
Private patron.
There's a question, Lucia.
Hi, yes, thank you. Very interesting talk, fascinating. In fact, I am interested particularly in the antiquities, as you might have understood.
Yes.
But I was interested to hear that he started to collect when in Messina, which is very interesting. And he went to Naples and continued to collect, I seem to remember you said, and then became a Levant Company consul. So I wonder whether there was a connection in that sense as well between the two countries, between Sicily and the Levant. And the previous question just answered one of mine. So you didn't find any particular document saying he wanted or he was asked to collect for anybody in particular?
No. Yes, I mean, obviously there were Greek antiquities in both Sicily and Turkey. So,
Yeah.
no.
The other thing that is very interesting, my question was, have you published anything about him as a resident merchant and consul in the Levant Company?
Well, only what I've written in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, which is quite. But I am going to put something on.
Because there are few testimonies of the Levant merchant, and I've often looked for different things to talk about the Levant merchants and their lifestyle. So also the photograph you showed is very interesting. So yes, an encouragement to publish.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. That was very, very interesting. I might reach out to you for more questions.
Thank you very much for your question. But just following on from that, was there any mention in his will of what he did with the collection?
No. I mean, there were a few bequests of various pictures, and I think I mentioned something that sounded like an antique sculpture, and a few paintings, which mainly went to his brother, but nothing about coins. So maybe he sold them all by then. No, all these things at one.
Just a very quick question.
Yes.
In the last slide, I think you had information about who his daughters married.
Yes.
And one of them is a Clutton.
Clutterbuck.
I have a portrait of an Owen Clutton and his wife Mary.
Oh, no,
I couldn't quite see how this.
No, Clutton. Richard Crawley, his son, married a Clutton.
Richard Crawley's son.
But the other family was Clutterbuck.
Yes.
Which is different.
I don't know where this Owen Clutton came in. Perhaps he was
yes, well,
father of the lady.
I have I have, yes, I have researched them as well, but that's a bit of another story.
Yes.
But yes,
What's it going to do next?
what am I going to do next? Well, finish all this, finish all this and put it in publishable state, and then I don't know.
Is there a copy of this online or?
Not yet, but there will be.
Right.
Yes, when I finish writing and finalising it all. I had to shorten it quite a bit for this, so there's quite a bit more, which will go in the written version.
And then you're planning a book publication.
Oh, no, I'm just going to put it on the internet.
Okay.
And then, because the Levantine heritage comes up very well in search engines. So I sort of figured that if it was there, people would find it. So I really want this for people to be able to access it.
Yeah.
There's not much point in researching for years and just sort of not doing anything with it.
So,
Very nice to meet you.
so unless there's any other sort of questions or comments, I'll just say thank you very much, Anne, for really fascinating talk. And I love the way that you sort of brought the life of Smyrna out as well. So thank you very much.
Pleasure.